That's it. That's working, mate.
Perfect.
Okay,
Perfect.
great.
And we're recording too.
Let's see if I can hide some people here. Thank you, Jeff, for the welcome comments. Looks like a very friendly audience today.
Yep.
So, as Jeff said, I'm going to talk about the future of food given climate change, but also what we can do about it. And this is somewhat of a standard talk that I give to various audiences. I adjusted it to this one as best I could. There may be some information that's repetitious, but I think most will be fairly new to everyone. And I'm sure most of you know what emeritus stands for. It means retired, but fortunately or unfortunately, that doesn't really apply to me. I feel privileged to be able to do what I'm doing right now, and as long as I can. Now we just have to learn how to make it to advance it. Come on, no. There we go. So yes, I did grow up on a 1-cow dairy farm, and in the upper left, there I am many years later on vacation in Costa Rica, of all things, taking a tour of a small dairy farm. The gentleman had, and his wife had, oh, I don't know, maybe 9 cows, but they made amazing cheese. And being a tourist, I was offered the opportunity to milk the cow. I milked the cow in about 3 minutes, and they were stunned, like riding a bike. You never forget how to milk a cow. And if I think you can see my arrow, there's up here, there is basically a big rubber bladder into which the farmer would put manure to produce the gas that went to the cheese house. And I got all excited about the manure, another first for a tourist. But I'm a farm kid at heart. I'm a parent, like many of us, 2 daughters, son-in-law. And when you think about climate change, you really have to think about them. That pretty much keeps me going. As Jeff mentioned, I've held multiple positions at Cornell, leadership roles, and anybody in one of those positions better be looking out at the big picture, and climate change certainly is the big picture. Lower left, I've worked in California for many years, mainly in processing tomatoes, which at the time had 325,000 acres. On the right, we all love to eat. Some of us love to have a few of those, what I call social lubricants, the alcoholic beverages. Another part of my past, I enlisted college, quit college, joined the Marines so I could go to Vietnam back in those days. And I used that point with certain audiences, and it really helps. And recently I had a physical and asked my doctor, well, how long will I live? He looked at me and said, oh, 10 years. And he was pretty close. The actuary tables say about the same thing. That's the median age at which someone of my stature at 75 will live. I got a hell of a lot to do. And that's why I'm here, to tell this story. I'm trying to figure out how to, I guess we'll just do it this way. Okay. I like this quote from Edward Abbey: better a cruel truth than a comfortable delusion when one is talking about climate change. And I ask audiences, what's this? Most everyone says Earth, but Carl Sagan has a better way of looking at it. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity and all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. I think he said it spot on. You're all familiar with how climate change works. Solar radiation comes down, goes through that yellow band, which is the space in which we live, that blanket, but not everybody appreciates it is only about 8 miles high. Some places on the planet it's 3 miles high, other places 11, on average about 8. That's where all the action occurs. Radiation comes down, warms up the surface of the Earth. That radiant heat goes upward, encounters greenhouse gases that absorb it, re-radiate it back. Trouble is, of course, We're making that blanket denser and it's holding more and more heat. Three terms we hear: global warming is what I just described. That thin layer around the globe is warming. That global warming, it results in climate change. As we were before I started, I mentioned how I've lived here in upstate New York for 30 plus years, and the winters are much warmer. The climate for Ithaca, New York has changed. Weather, what's going on outside right now, or maybe we'll have a warm winter, a cold winter, that's weather. It's not climate change. Climate change is looking at multiple decades, typically 3, oftentimes 30 years. And if you really want to appreciate what that layer is like, when you're crossing the country in a jet and the pilot says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're at cruising altitude, look down," you're essentially looking through that thin layer. Or you're on the ground and you go to work very early in the morning at Cornell University while the sun's coming up, and you look up and see those jet trails. You're looking up through that thin layer. That's it. A lot of people don't appreciate that fully. And you've all seen the hockey stick. Yesterday, we had 424 parts per million. A year ago, 421. That's about right. 3 parts per million per year, 50% higher than it should be. But not many people think of the atmosphere like this, like a bathtub. Yes, that's me, but those are not my legs. So if you think of the bathtub as the atmosphere, the faucet, pre-industrial revolution, and the drain were essentially the same volume. There was a much greenhouse gases coming into the atmosphere as we're going out. There was a balance. Today, we've turned up that faucet. The bathtub is filling up with greenhouse gases like the atmosphere, and we know the consequences. The goal now, it used to be the black line. Now it's the red line. The goal now is just to stop that red line from increasing anymore, and stabilize. It will take hundreds, if not thousands of years to get back to that black line. The goal now is to slow things down and stabilize. We all know where greenhouse gases come from, but I want to draw your attention to agriculture in the lower right. Sometimes there's confusion in the press elsewhere where you see, well, agriculture contributes like 30% of the greenhouse gases total to the atmosphere. Well, that's the entire food system. But if you just look at US agriculture, from the farms, immediate farm, it's about 11%. And the rest comes from transportation, electricity, industry, etc. And I'm sure you've all followed this, the IPCC sort of summary report that came out on March 20th. The UN Secretary General stated it pretty bluntly. The climate time bomb is ticking. Our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once. And they talked about having about 10 years to really make huge changes. Well, from March to now, it's about 118 months. That's how much time we have left to make some radical changes. And you're aware of the evidence is all around us. The fires, I didn't realize it, just reading that there are tremendous fires in Canada right now. 1 million acres have burned up recently. Made worse by climate change, not necessarily caused by climate change, again, as most of you are aware. The drought in California is pretty much eliminated, but not necessarily the Colorado Basin. There's still shortages there. Things like Mead has yet to fill up. Major glaciers are melting around the world, and we see storms like pictured in lower right, where Houston a few years ago had a downpour of 50 inches of rain. The atmosphere has more moisture, there's more energy, more turbulence. So now when it rains, it pours. I think most of you are from California on listening right now, and all of the Atmospheric rivers, again, I live in California too. That's how you typically get your annual rains, except now with more moisture in the atmosphere. A warmer ocean, allowing more moisture to be picked up by these storms. There's a lot more precipitation hitting the West Coast. And then there's things the models really can't handle. They're called tipping points, such as this. Once that tree starts to go, no turning back. Like say the melting of permafrost, more of it melts, more methane is released, more permafrost melts, etc. And it's a one-way track. So we're playing a dangerous game. Again, I think the audience, everyone understands that, we're going to hold it to 1.5 degrees C, you're going to get 2, etc. Again, we need to act quickly. And it's tough, especially on the younger generation. Worldwide, there was a survey done by a group out of the UK. Nearly 75% of those 16 to 25 describe their future as frightening given climate change. 40% are hesitant of children. And I often speak on the Cornell campus to student audiences, and I'll ask, please describe your future in one word given climate change. And it's not unusual to hear hopeless quite often. But on a rare occasion, someone will say passionate. That's because that individual knows what they're going to do to tackle climate change, and they're passionate about it. And I purposely put this slide and the next one in because eco-anxiety, people are really anxious about the world around them and what's happening, especially from climate change. That's on the rise, and it's not just you, it's all of us. I've had my pretty bad days at times, given the space I work in. How do you deal with that? Feeling justified. I can walk out in my backyard into the flowers in the summertime, especially, and just absorb nature. That really helps me. Avoid doom scrolling. I do it because of my business, but others should not. Work together with others like you're doing in your own organization. The antidote to despair is action. There's everything we can do. Choose your battles, and just bear in mind you're not alone. Get help if needed. So, what are the different ways to tell the climate change story and raise more awareness and action? We can talk about the personal. I mentioned my children, our grandchildren, health issues, risk to the economy, loss of biodiversity. But then there's this thing about food. Why food to tell this story? It is hard to imagine anything that is more relevant to our lives than food. To the best of my knowledge, we all eat. It's part of our cultures, our family traditions. It's emotional. I don't know about others, but I get really emotional over food. We enjoy it. There's no social lubricants that we enjoy. It's important to the economy, easy to talk about. So there's unlimited stories to tell about food and how it's changing because of climate change. The audience for the story is primarily US and other rich countries. We cause a mess, and we've got the capacity to make a difference. Another thing, most of us don't realize where food comes from. Avocados, US, Mexico, we get most of our avocado from Mexico, some come from California, certainly, coffee from the coffee belt, teas from Asia, sushi rice. 99% of the sushi rice consumed in the US comes from California. Cashews, Vietnam, Scotch, Scotland, blueberries in the wintertime for us in the Northeast mostly come from Peru. Beef, mainly from the Central States. Fish sticks, an amazing story. Pollock, captured in the Bering Sea by the US fleet, worth about $1 billion a year, is shipped to China for processing, and then into fish sticks and fish fillets, and imported into the US. Where does it come from? It's not just a place. Don't forget, it's people. If you're at the local farmer's market, it's coming from nearby. Some local farmers producing the fruit and vegetables you're buying. If you enjoy natural vanilla, the woman in the upper right-hand corner is pollinating vanilla blossoms, probably, most likely in Madagascar. every vanilla blossom needs to be pollinated by hand. The dairy farmer in the middle on the left from Wisconsin, could be Minnesota or New York or California, producing the dairy products we need. The gentleman with the big smile, an Aussie, growing grass-fed beef. The U.S. imports about 40% of the grass-fed beef from Australia. If you want one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, fish the Bering Sea, lower left. And finally, lower right, the cacao that we enjoy as chocolate is produced mostly 70% of it in Western Africa. This family is growing cacao. They make $4 a day so that we can enjoy our chocolate. So the food comes from land and sea. People, it's changing. Another little set of facts here that most of us don't appreciate. In the US, farmers and ranchers constitute 1.3% of our employed population. That's 1 in 75. A few are producing our food. 98% of US farms are family farms. 50% require off-farm income. It's a hazardous industry because one, not only to the, let's say, the head of the household, but also because the families work on the farm. And in some regions in the US, farm populations and rancher populations have higher suicide rates than the general population around it. Climate change is making it tougher. So we look at the bar chart on the left. You see that almost 89, almost 90% of the farms are considered small scale farms. They produce about 18, they're producing 18% of everything we grow. Just think of production. That could be animal feed, it could be animals, it could be human food. And then if we go up to the third bar over, large scale farms, they constitute 3% of our farms, but they produce 47% of all the farm products in the US. The point here, most are family farms, and there's a lot of small farms. It's not all big ag. And finally, if you look at the far right, you see 2% of the farms are not family owned, and they produce about 70% of everything produced on our farms in the US and ranches. Just a lot of times I hear comments about industrial agriculture, big scale agriculture, but I hope this puts it in perspective. But most of you are from California. I think you have a pretty good idea what farming's all about. And then we have to get it to our destination. If you think about what are called choke points, great paper out of Chatham House a few years back. Not that long ago, the Suez Canal was blocked, not by climate change, but by a ship, but it had an effect of billions of dollars of losses in, among other things, food products that could not get through the Suez Canal. This is nothing unusual, and there'll be more of that occurring in the future with climate change. We have about 60,000 miles of roads near the coast that are susceptible to sea surges. Rail lines are getting flooded occasionally. Even aircraft, if it's too hot, some aircraft can simply not take off. Only a small portion of our food is actually transported by air, but it's another effect that climate change is having on our transportation system. And I guess if you want to see this last example on the positive side, that's the summer sea ice in the Arctic. And the extent of it should be out by the yellow line. That's like pre-industrial revolution. However, because of warming, the sea ice retreats every year further and further. So the blue area, this ocean between the ice and that yellow line, is about 350,000 square miles, which is now ocean, blue ocean, absorbing solar radiation, melting more ice, which opens up more blue sea. You get the point. That's what's causing the retreat of the ice in the Arctic. But from a transportation standpoint, shipping, as this opens up from Northern Asia to Northern Europe, could be reduced by about 40% in time. So, in a way, that's a positive benefit of climate change to the transportation system. So now let's look at a simple plant. Okay. Whoop, rain. Well, let's look at what's happening to the plants that we depend on for life. I think we're all aware plants need air, specifically carbon dioxide, water, warmth, soil, and sunlight. They're all changing. But one thing that's not changing is sunlight. And this really leads to some interesting stories. Increasing carbon dioxide. I'm sure many of you have heard comments from deniers saying, well, wait a minute, climate change is great for agriculture because it actually benefits our crops. Well, that's true. In fact, it benefits about 95% of our crops. They grow faster, yield higher, etc. But the consensus is, thank you very much, that's going to be offset by more extreme weather. Weeds, when grown under higher levels of CO2, become harder to control with certain herbicides, specifically glyphosate or Roundup. So the studies were done that at some point that will not control weeds when the levels of CO2 get high enough. Really interesting story by Lou Ziska. He collected pollen from goldenrod from museum collections starting in 1849 to the 1990s. And we looked at pollen protein content in that pollen and found a 30% decrease over time. He also did control studies, and basically protein and pollen in that very important source pollen for bees in the fall is declining because of increasing CO2. The big one here, however, is human nutrition. Studies have shown when crop plants are grown at higher levels of CO2, proteins decline, vitamins decline, and essential minerals decline in many of our major crops. In rice, the B vitamins decline about 30%. And there are a few billion people around the world that depend on rice, and they're ready of dietary deficiencies. And there can be changes in flavors and colors. Let's just look at vegetables. These are all positive, actually. Under increased CO2, there's increases in fructose, glucose, sugars, antioxidants, phenols, flavonoids, ascorbic acid. And I always jokingly say, because one of my daughters wants to eat more kale, maybe kale will actually taste better in the future. Changes in water. Basically, the entire global water system is changing. We talked about more extremes, more downpours, but also more droughts. It's warmer, we're getting more rain, less snow. And see where water falls, when it falls, how it falls, all changing. And one example here is Peru and Chile, from which we import about $5 billion of agricultural products a year, are dependent, like some of those crops are dependent on meltwater from the ice cap. That ice cap will be gone in less than 20 years. It has huge impacts on agricultural production in Peru and Chile, let alone communities and so on that depend on that water, and also hydroelectric power. Where does it fall? As of the end of March, you can see out west things looking much better, but there's still a drought in the Midwest. As of the end of March, this has been last year was a tough year for drought because a good part of the US was in drought conditions. The end of the century, looking forward, so if we look at the Northeast, for example, where I'm living, it's getting blue, which means we're actually going to gain more precipitation, total precipitation per year. We're already up about 5 inches total of precipitation on an annual basis. Things are looking good. And at 1 o'clock Eastern time today, I was not able to join another event, but it was a webinar on migration to the Great Lakes region because we will have water. and other conditions. So basically climate change migration to this part of the world, because of those conditions wherever elsewhere, things are going to continue to get drier. More downpours. In the northeast, we're up about 55% in heavy precipitation events. That's like the top 1% of these extreme events. 42% in the Midwest. So for us, that means, and I've experienced these, I mean, it really pours very briefly, but a lot of water comes down in a short period of time. If you're a farmer, okay, there goes your soil, there goes your freshly seeded planting, there goes the nutrients, etc. And it's hard to get into a field in the middle of summer when you've had a huge downpour. Even hail is predicted to change in some regions and get larger, because that little ice crystal that ultimately becomes hail is getting tossed more often upwards into the cold atmosphere and getting bigger and bigger because there's more turbulence in our storms. Folks in the Netherlands are a little concerned about this and all their vast greenhouse production. Warming, we're just going to pick one thing here, and that is nights are warming, winters are warming twice as fast as summers. And if you're not aware, almost all fruit and all nut trees require a winter dormant period. If they don't have that, they don't produce. So a couple of years ago, 2017, Georgia, the peach state, had very few peaches because the previous winter was too warm. In California, pistachio growers about the same time, same thing, lost millions of dollars in production because the previous winter was too warm. Here's a great paper that was in ProPublica talking about human migration. And you can see today, the dark green is basically where things are okay for us to exist. But it's going to get tougher by 2070. And you can see, again, the paper is actually about human migration, how the best place to live is going to be much further north, and crops are moving north as well. Huge changes on the horizon, looking at the worst case scenario. And they include in this article a chart like this that shows you can look for any county in the US and see what it's going to be like in 2040 to 2060. And if we just look at Pinal County, Arizona, obviously it's going to get really hot, humid. Yields are going to go down. The higher the number, the greater the impact. Economic damage, fairly serious. But now, down here, I live in Tompkins County, New York. Those numbers are very small. We're going to stay here. No questions asked, even though we have a long winter right now. All right. If you take a typical dinner menu, you can almost guarantee everything on that menu is changing, whether it's the main course, desserts, you name it. Something's up with it. So I'm going to walk through that. So I love this, calling these social lubricants, but water. A lot of these industries are water dependent. Water is falling at different times. Precipitation patterns are different. The craft beer brewers in California a few years ago, while during the drought, had a tough time because they oftentimes tap surface water. But when that stream gets low or starts to dry up, obviously the mineral content changes. It affects the quality of the beer. Wine grapes are sensitive to higher temperatures, more acidity, etc., changing aroma and flavors. The one humorous story has to do with Scotch. Scotch, while aging right now in oak barrels, there's a large portion of it evaporates, 2% by volume every year, basically evaporates through the oak barrels. It amounts to 29 million gallons a year. It's going to get warmer. If you drink Scotch, keep that in mind. They're going to start losing more and more. They call it the angel share. Salads, avocados in California, the heat's going to take its toll in the next 20 years. So tomatoes probably get a little sweeter with higher CO2, onions more pungent. Lettuce production will actually expand in the US because winters are warming and they'll be able to grow it in more and different areas. The hamburger, sesame. The sesame producers in Tanzania, Africa love climate change because sesame does better. And they're actually expanding production in Tanzania to supply the world with sesame seed. Here again in the burger, we talk about in the Southwest, our beef. A lot of the ranchers are really struggling because of the long-term drought has affected grazing lands. They have to sell their animals early. Ranchers are suffering, being hit hard. Red meat in the back, our approach to that is treat it as a delicacy, not a staple. You can still eat it. That's what I do. Fish populations are changing in the ocean. Chicken, probably okay, because most are produced indoors in regular confined environments where they can somewhat control temperature and humidity and so on. But definitely the main courses are changing as well as everything else on the menu. And I added this in here because last year the drought on the Canadian prairies affected the production of mustard, and there was a shortage of Dijon mustard last year. Sides, breads, oh my goodness, you know, nutritional quality wheat is declining. Those are chips, as in fish and chips. A few years ago, because of drought and high temperatures in the UK, potatoes were shorter by a ½ inch. Everybody noticed their chips weren't as big as they used to be. Rice, I mentioned, decline in nutritional quality and thick of spices. Many from India, parts of Asia, where the monsoon season has changed, and they're also experiencing extreme heat, which will affect quantity and quality of many of our favorite spices. And coffee, I'm sure you've heard that story many times. I mentioned chocolate, most of which is produced cacao in Western Africa. Climate change is hitting hard there. And what I say for the dairy product like the ice cream, well, hot cows give less milk. So a little humor doesn't hurt. This is serious. Without ice cream, there would be darkness and chaos. Melting glaciers are bad enough, but the loss of coffee is downright terrifying. Trying to raise awareness about climate change through food. Does anybody care? Well, we did a national survey a while back and asked, among other questions, how concerned are you about food choices and climate change? And the blue are Democrats, red is Republican. Please note that almost 2/3 of the Republicans said, I'm concerned. But then asked, is climate change a crisis? Democrats, 59%, Republicans, 20%. But look up above. When you talk about food, it changes the response. So is this an opportunity, a way to bridge that gap? Down below, what would you really like to be protected most from climate change? Everybody's up there in coffee and chocolate, but surprisingly beer and wine, less so. Are you willing to pay more? Or if something is food is grown with climate friendly practices? Here again, 87% Democrats, 63 Republicans. You want to learn more? Again, there's interest across the political divide in learning more. We talk about food often at table. Most everybody does. We talk about climate change, not often. Can we bring those conversations together? I think we must, using food. And clearly, age makes a difference. The younger individuals in general are willing to pay more, discuss food more often, want to know more, and are willing to join a campaign to make a difference. My apologies. And lastly, we asked the open-ended question about describe what do you think about climate change effects on food? And 20% of the people came up with it was like famine, hunger, scarcity, starvation, and shortage. It's on people's minds. Something to be tapped. Okay, you can get depressed, overwhelmed, ignore, or you can confront. I love that word because it also, the synonyms are challenge, tackle, threaten, meet head on, face up to, defy. Pick one. There is a lot going on out in the world to keep the menu stocked the stewards of the land, farmers and ranchers, are focusing on soil health. They're focusing on improved water management, either not enough or too much. They're looking at diversification instead of where you can and where it's feasible, don't just grow one or two crops, grow multiple crops so you still have an income. Plan and adapt. Things are changing. Food and beverage businesses, they're looking at their supply chain. Back to how do you get the product from point A to point B, from the raw product to your facilities. Look at that supply chain. They're investing in suppliers, farmers. They're encouraging farmers to adopt the best practices, and they're mitigating their own impact. And some are even looking at alternative ingredients. And here's an interesting story. In the UK, they now have a beer made from bread that would typically be thrown away, called, of all things, toast. That's an ingenious way to use what would have gone into landfill or somewhere else, animal feed, but now they're making a beer. Science, to me, this is an extraordinary opportunity to tell the value, people, the value of science, connecting it to climate change. I think top of the list is developing resistant varieties, but also modeling. What's the future going to look like? Well, if I'm a farmer, what am I going to, be dealing with in a few years down the road? And how can I deal with it? And so scientists are developing tools. All farmers adapt to the new reality. And I have to put in genetic engineering because first, there's no substantiated evidence that foods from genetically engineered crops are less safe than foods from non-genetically engineered crops. Multiple academies of science around the world say this. And the latest technology is gene editing. So imagine removing a key from a piano with 32,000 keys by editing it. That isn't much different than removing one gene from the genome of a corn plant that has 32,000 genes. What can we all do? Talk about it. Find your greater purpose. Get to understand what's really happening. Climate change leaders. I think that's what this group is all about, among other things. Pick those things that matter. I enjoy taking out the recycling, but in the big picture of things, it's not that important. You are involved. Find something you're good at, because we can get overwhelmed, get so many directions to go. Figure out what you're best at. And I love this quote from Greta: "No one is too small to make a difference." And there's this paper I just read, just came out. What really changes people's behavior? There's something called, no, it's my apologies. We all judge our behavior against what others are doing. So these are actually ranked. The most important is the top one. So if you see your neighbor installing solar, it says they're going to stop flying, you are actually more likely to change your behavior in alignment with that. And that's why it's so important to talk about climate change actions you are taking, because basically you're setting the bar and others will follow. Oh, you're doing that? Well, maybe I should do that. Another thing to do, and these are getting lower and lower in sort of ranking, financial incentives. Become familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act. There's so many financial incentives in there. It's amazing. Appeals help others to make changes in behavior. Personal and public commitment makes a big change. Feedback. You're looking at your electric meter. That helps. And finally, education, informing people. But actually the big one is at the top. And that's thinking about other behaviors and telling people what you're doing to convince them and encourage them to make changes too. And if you're not familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, please check it out. There are some serious incentives in here for purchase of electric vehicles, heat pumps, solar installation, etc. Unfortunately, I put a geothermal system in a year ahead of time, but it's all right. So back to food. It's a common ground we all eat. What if consumers, chefs, restaurateurs, the food media, the food industry, producers, all start telling the same story? There are no villains. We're all in this together. We all need each other. Can we create a great awakening using food? And that's defined as creating a much deeper state of awareness and need for action on climate change by way of food. We need to act quickly at scale. We have 118 months, but stop. Every day we eat, and we all eat. So we have a book out and a website providing information, helping people know what to do. It talks in detail. Literally, the core of the book is a menu, walking through from before dinner drinks to desserts and coffee. What's happening, what's changing, what's being done, what we can all do to keep that menu stocked. Getting a lot of positive encouragement about this effort. Got a couple of awards. The Noah Plant Stewards Book Club. I've been being interviewed and doing lots of podcasts. I've probably done 150 to 200 presentations like this, in-depth invited presentations. We all eat, it's all changing. The stories are unlimited. And lastly, a great paper came out a few years ago about stabilizing the climate. Going all the way back to me in the bathtub, we have to stabilize things. So think about food. Okay, we need to incentivize a mass shift away from fossil fuel. If you're worried about your scotch, you got to do this. Share information on sources of emissions. All right, we can talk about agriculture. We can talk about food, etc. Where are the emissions? And put that in context, relative context to other sources. Help people realize growing risk. Hey, I'm worried about my rutabagas or whatever it might be, but you can get people's attention. We all eat. Let's create a network. Change lifestyles. We can all do that, especially changing diets. And educate in new ways. Food's right there. So climate change is a grand challenge, but we can tackle it if we decide to, if we have the will. And with that, and we've also just tackled this one, COVID, in the last few years. But we've got the ability to address diseases, look at the art we've done, the food we produce, the technology. We can do it. We just have to say we want to and that we're going to. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Very interesting. Wow. So what do I what do I need to do? What do I need to change my diet to? Is it as simple as just saying become a vegetarian or become a vegan, buy local?
Number of things. As I said, and I can't be a hypocrite because I occasionally eat red meat. It's just treated as a delicacy, not a staple to your diet. In the US, the actual percentage of people that are vegans or vegetarians, it's relatively low. It's like, I think 6 or 8%.
Really?
Yes, if that's an option you want, I'm not saying don't do it. And you can have a nutritious diet, etc. But specifically to red meat, I meant the approach is treated as a delicacy.
Interesting.
Thanks, Mike. That was really great. And we're going to take the next 20 minutes to break out into small groups. And I posted a few questions, which I'll read to you in chat to kind of spark the conversation. Sorry, there's big noise outside, distracted me. Okay, so they're in chat. What are a few interesting takeaway messages from today's talk? In the next few months, what are you inspired to do differently after hearing Mike's talk that will support a healthier planet? And who will you talk about what you are doing in your life to tackle climate change? So let's see.
And have you put those in the chat?
They are in the chat.
Okay, good.
And I'm going to just rearrange a few rooms here because it seems like people are not where they were before. So let me just get them going here.
So while you're doing that, Melissa, let me ask Mike another question. Where do the big most of us get our food from the grocery store, right? When we go to Safeway or whatever your local grocery store is. what is the grocery store industry doing? Are they trying to improve diets and take care of climate change or not?
That's a really, really good question. Oop. Getting carried away here. I just spoke a month ago to an international group of farmers, producers, shippers, etc., from the West Coast and South America. And I think the reaction was not that strong, but obviously they know things are changing, and to stay in business, they've got to make some changes. It's a business decision almost. You know, things aren't available, the seasons are changing, more stress for crops. What I would really like to do, this may be a bit of a dream, is to engage at least one national chain, and I've got one in mind. I reached out to them and see if they're interested in starting to put subtle climate change stories on the shelf. Maybe just say, okay, we don't have peaches this week because, you know, not just because of extreme weather in wherever. But it's all part about telling that story, and have a retailer like that do that would be just, I think, remarkable to get someone to lead in that space.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, Melissa.
Just to add to that, I mean, like Mars has invested, I think Mars, $1 billion in, you know, their supply chains. So the companies are moving to keep, just again, stay in business.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're going to go out into breakout rooms for 20 minutes, and then we'll see you back here in the main room. There we go. Jeff, your name didn't come up, so I didn't put you in a room.
Yeah, well, the host is never included.
Yeah, and we're both hosts,
so I should stop recording now too, right?
Yeah.
Raise your hand and take the question, depending on the amount of time. Does everybody want to do it that way? Or put your question,
Let's just decide and do it that way, Catherine.
or put your question in the chat room.
Yeah, if you have a question, put it in the chat.
Or
Just
anything
unmute yourself and ask the question.
Okay, James.
Michael, one question I have, and this is around production of beef. I think we know that well, down in South America, a lot of the rainforest is being converted into land to raise beef, and the issue with beef is that it produces a lot of methane, which is you know, affects the climate much more than just pulling carbon dioxide. And so one of the things I see a compelling reason to consider that if we give up beef, and we would be coming at it in two directions, because we wouldn't be changing the land usage. We could rewild that area. There's areas could be rewild, thus producing trees that absorb carbon dioxide and make oxygen. And in addition, we wouldn't be putting that methane into the atmosphere. So I'm curious why you've chosen not to make a stronger issue. Maybe just giving that beef would be the most important thing to give up entirely, if possible. I'm just curious from your point of view.
Chapter that I wrote on beef, we sent, you know, sections of the book to 60 different experts for review. And I've written in there, stop eating red meat. The reviewer said, that's good. You just lost about 85% or 90% of the US population.
Mm.
You know, they're going to say, no way, you know. So, and I also looked at my own habits and said, okay, once in a while I have red meat. If we treat it as a staple, it would still contribute enormously to the reduction of methane production. I mean, the US, we eat 3 times more red meat than most other countries per capita. That alone is unhealthy. let alone for individuals, our own health, but also the planet. So the book and our story is not intended to preach. It's to lay out a story and information and let the reader decide on their own what is best. I think I'm trying to respond to your question. Sure, we could say don't eat red meat. And if I get up in front of an audience and say that, it's okay, stop flying.
Mhm.
We had that conversation in the breakout. Stop flying. You shouldn't be flying. Well, what about my grandkids? So go ahead. If I'm not answering your question adequately.
No, I think you're making an answer that most people would, and it is difficult. It's difficult. I see difference in flying because we're coming out with meat substitutes now, and there's also health issues. I mean, obviously around red beef that go beyond the carbon footprint, but
right, absolutely.
We in the United States, I think you have to say, have not been good at it when it comes to moderation of anything.
No.
And so I think it gives, for me, and this me, and it's just my opinion, it's a mixed message. So and I know it's politically difficult to say that, but to couch it in terms of, if you considered giving anything up, this is the most carbon unfriendly. And I know you said that, but I have a stronger view on it than you do, and I'll own that.
Yeah. And in the breakout, I also stressed that the story is not intended for all of us to change our diets. It's also to reduce all those other sources of greenhouse gases, the travel, the electricity use, it's everything. If you want the menu to remain stocked, we got to go after all greenhouse gas emissions.
I agree.
Mhm.
Our food. Okay. So
That's my opinion, and that's what
Yeah.
I've done.
thank you.
Great.
Okay, Libby, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Michael, for a great presentation. And I was thinking about the big agricultural production, big ag. And am I wrong in assuming that their success depends greatly on using pesticides? It's hard to imagine that big ag are organic farmers. And if that's true, if they have to use pesticides and their years of growing one crop is limited, wouldn't it be better to have more small farms and support the small farms and make them organic farms rather than genetically modified seeds that, in my understanding, in the big picture down the time track, will pay a big price on the planet and our health?
Yeah, I think you've asked several questions, but that's quite all right. Just bear in mind that some of these big ag companies produce organic products because they get a premium price. So if all of a sudden the processing tomato, this is not a correct, I'm just using this as an example, I'm not sure, but let's say a producer in California, well, wait a minute, I can get 25% more return on my investment by growing organic processing tomatoes. I'm going to put in 400 acres of it.
Mm.
That's not unusual. So, and to your comment about having a lot of small farms, who will be the farmers? How many people want to take a job like that? That is extremely risky. Your income is not assured at all. That's why I shared more about the farmer's story. It's a tough business and it's getting tougher. I had someone say, well, let's convert all of the Midwest to small farms. Excuse me. Who will take on that land and farm it? Genetically engineered crops, as I said, are safe to consume. That is the science. How they've been implemented has been a problem, because now we have weeds that are super weeds. They're resistant to most herbicides because they consistently put the same herbicide on to control them, and everybody said this is going to happen. But I think they are still a part of the toolbox that we need to grow our food. I'm not sure if I got all of your questions, but come back what I missed or what you don't agree with, it's fine.
Thank you. No, I got it. I think I just was under the impression that the big ag had genetically modified seeds, then that was not a good thing.
Well, and when you say big ag, I did work in California and I met some large scale farmers that were probably more sustainable than most small farmers because they had the capacity to make changes overnight that had a huge benefit. We interviewed in our book a sheep farmer at the headwaters of the Colorado River, 3,500 sheep. With the gentleman and his farm has received multiple sustainability awards because of how he grazes on the land and so on. So scale always isn't necessarily bad, in my humble opinion.
True.
Do you have any questions in the chat, Catherine? We've got 5 minutes left.
Melissa has a question, and there are no questions in the chat.
Okay.
Does anybody else have a question? Otherwise, I will go. Oh. Well, I have to say, Mike, you do challenge a lot of my assumptions, my underlying assumptions, which is really, I think it's important for me and for all of us to, widen our horizons. So I'm really grateful to hear from your point of view. I'm curious about, I read somewhere in I think Optimist Daily that in the UK, they're thinking about or trying to put labels on certain foods that identify the embodied carbon, which I personally think would be really interesting and useful, for my shopping, and I assume for other people. Have you heard about that? And do you know if that's being done?
I've heard a lot about that, and I think it'd be great to have that. And I've seen some of those tools where you basically can go to a website and click on whatever, and it'll give you some estimate. At the same time, it's really tricky because where does it come from? It could come from multiple different, some crops are grown around the world. So the distance product A from, say, Madagascar versus Wisconsin, and if you live in Chicago, that's a heck of a difference in transportation distance, but it's the same raw product. How it's grown can vary. Maybe I'm just making this up, but that thing coming, whatever it is from Madagascar, is grown with the most sustainable low carbon input you can imagine. But the one in Wisconsin is not. So there's so many different components to the story, how it's stored, how it's packaged, how it's transported, how it's grown. It's difficult, but there's a lot of people working on it. I have a dear colleague in Colombia who is working on it. If anybody's going to crack that nut, he will do it, and he'll do it in a manner that's really based on facts.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay. In the last 3 minutes, Pam, do you want to tell, is there another meeting like this, or what comes next, or what would you like people to know before they leave?
Yes, I would really, really like to thank you, Michael, and bring your point of view. And it's really a lot to think about. And thank you for everyone else's input also. Libby is actually here, and probably Libby, you will be doing a workshop event next week on plastics. It was Shirley. You want to say a few words about that and the time?
Uh-oh.
I don't know. Oh, your sound isn't working.
Lost your sound.
Wait, Libby and Shirley are famous in our organization for their information and work that they've done with, the name of the workshop is called Cutting Ties with Plastic. And they're really, really, will have a lot of information, a lot of what's new, a lot of what to do. And I think you'll really enjoy their knowledge and them especially. So next Wednesday, is that Wednesday? No, it's
Thursday.
Thursday. Okay. It's on the in website. So
Thursday at
it's,
1.
thank you.
Okay, so that's it, everybody. We'll close the formal meeting now. It's 1:30, but I'll leave it open for another 10 minutes in case anybody wants to chat, and I'll be here as well. So thanks again, Michael, very much.
Yes.
Yes,
Presentation
thank you.
and
The opportunity.
stimulating talk, and I wish you all the best in all the presentations you do from here
Yes.
on out too. So thank
For
you.
the record, we're also starting a documentary film based on the book.
Oh,
Cool.
Oh,
good,
good.
Great.
good.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye. Check your
Bye. Thanks.